really like this topic tonight. We're going to talk about leadership. And so when I thought about how to display leadership, I asked Dan to create an image of Jesus washing feet. I think this is the most powerful example. Just the image, again, shout out to Dan for the creating the image here, but also the idea that this man is washing feet. Not just, the act of washing feet, but who it is that's washing the feet, right? And you want to talk about leadership. The best model of leadership is servant leadership, and the best model of servant leadership was Jesus, right? And so this is an opportunity for us to dig into this. We're going to talk about a couple different types of leadership that, as I reviewed the topic and prayed about it and dove into it, 4 types of leaderships that we can kind of fall into, and there's going to be like an overlap of them a little bit. So if you can imagine like a Venn diagram of 4 different circles kind of coming together, and Jesus being at the center of that, that's kind of what this is. So that's not to say that any of them is better than the other. There may be parts of the leadership styles that you definitely relate to, and some that you don't relate to, or parts of this one, a little bit of that one, and really into this one. There's no right or wrong answers to this, and every person is going to be different about this. But the thing about this is that Jesus embodied them all. And so we think about this like the Savior of the world right here on his knees and washing the feet of the disciples, right? The people that he led, right? So too often we think about leadership and it's like, you do this for me. I'm your boss. I'm your leader. You do for me. But Jesus did just the opposite, and in the sense that he even gave his life for us, right? And so lots to talk about leadership. But again, the example for everything is going to be about Jesus being being a leader here. And so the title for the topic is going to be Leading Like Jesus. So then something that's really important about leadership is that before one can learn how to lead, one must first learn how and who to follow. And I think this is a really important part about this, because a lot of us want to be, especially as men, want to be thrust into leadership positions right away and instantly, especially if we go into like the workplace and things like that. However, we must first learn how to follow before we can learn how to lead. And I think that's a really important step that a lot of us want to skip in terms of that management and leadership process. But also who to lead. That's who to follow, I'm sorry. Because that's obviously, you can follow bad examples. And following bad examples gets you nowhere fast. So having the right example before you and having the right model to follow, I think is just as important as the emphasis on like learning how and who to lead here, to follow. And then this is another important part, that leadership is not about power or control. And that's a big mistake a lot of people make about leadership. But it's actually about service, sacrifice, and responsibility. And so serving others through your leadership, through your position, sacrificing for the benefit of the others that you are leading, and the responsibility. So a lot of people, like leaders, will take responsibility for when things go well, but they blame others when things don't go well, right? So real leaders are the ones that take responsibility for, hey, you know what, this is my fault. We came up short because I didn't do this, or I did this wrong. Or, the team succeeded because, I led them, but they did the work, right? So there's a level of humility. We're going to talk a lot about that today too, that ties into this. And another common misconception about leadership is not always the loudest person in the room. And I think this is sometimes where we just assume that, the guy that talks the most is automatically the leader. And it's not necessarily the case. I know I get to talk the most in the group because I founded this group, right? I'm going to call, there's some squatters' rights on that. I'm kidding. But we also get a lot of opportunities to hear from other men in our tribe and in our groups that get to speak to us, and the men that are more qualified to lead than I am. So, and lastly, the leadership isn't an opportunity and not a title. And this is so important because we've all been in experiences where we worked with somebody. Just because they're a manager doesn't mean they're a leader. And maybe we've been in situations at the workplace. I'll relate a lot of this to the workplace. You can even relate this to your home. If your parents, for example, if your father wasn't a great leader, but he was still, by title, he was still your dad. So you still kind of had to follow his lead at times, right? So, but again, leadership is an opportunity. And that's where you have an opportunity to step up into things rather than just saying, hey, I'm the boss, what I say goes. There are a lot of people that are in leadership positions that still defer to people beneath them in the hierarchy because they lack leadership, right? So again, a lot to unpack tonight. I'm going to buzz through this so we can get into discussion, because I really want to get discussion going amongst us tonight about these things. But biblical leadership, I really broke it down to 4 different types of leadership. And number 1 was servant leadership, which we talked about is in the prime example of action, and that is Jesus washing the feet, right? Another type of leadership is going to be humble leadership. Again, not necessarily being the loudest person in the room. Strong leadership, and this is through actions, not through words. And then the quiet leadership, and this is more somebody that's not beating their chest, but they're getting it done, and without all the accolades, requiring accolades for that. And then we're going to talk about places to lead. And this is the number one place that men are called to lead is in the home. We are the head of the household. We are called to lead there. You're also called to lead in the workplace. I think this is a big important factor for us, that we impact a lot of people that we oversee, not just in the home. It's a smaller network, but in the workplace, there's probably a lot more people you lead in the workplace than you do at home, most likely. And then lastly, in the community. I almost wanted to tie this community and church, but I left it at community because we can go beyond just the walls of City Tribe as leaders and serving our community, but also leading in the community. And I think we can lead in different sectors of the community. That radiates the impact of the church rather than just leading in the church itself. So, and then as we talk about this, again, the first one we're going to talk about is going to be servant leadership. And I love one of the definitions I found online about servant leadership, and it says, a leadership style that focuses on serving the needs of others and helping them to grow. Focus on serving the needs of others and helping them to grow. So it's not about me. And then leadership as a whole, we're going to a theme with us is it's not about me as the leader. It's about who I'm leading and what I'm doing for them. A lot of, especially men in the workplace, again, using this as an example, we are afraid to pour into men that are below us because we don't want them to outgrow us. Right? Because what happens is in your mind, if you're insecure about what you're teaching them, about them to get better at their jobs, you think that they're a threat to take your job, right? So you don't teach them everything. You kind of hold back a little bit. So then that's only deserving them, but it's also deserving you, right? So now, but real leadership comes when this guy, you can see further than you can go, right? So I know this guy's going to go further than I can. So I'm going to push him to go further than me. And so when you do this, you're planting a seed in that man that's going to go further than you're going to go, but also good leadership recognizes that the development of other leaders is so critical to industries in business, in families, in churches, and all those things. Developing more leaders is better than you being the best leader possible, right? And in fact, that's saying that you're the best leader possible. So again, helping them to grow and serving the needs. Find where the deficiencies are, help them in that, and then accelerate them to the next level. One example of this, I forgot to get volunteers for reading. So I'm going to get a volunteer to read several scriptures tonight. So can I get a volunteer for Matthew chapter 20, verse 28? So Joaquin, in just 1 second. So this is going to be an example of this type of leadership style right here. So Matthew chapter 20, verse 28. Joaquin, do you have that up yet?
Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many.
I think, again, that's the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate sign of leadership right there is when Jesus didn't come to be served. He had every right for us to serve him. He was the Messiah. He was the Savior. He had every right to say, hey, you know what, you guys just bow down to me and just do as I say. But instead, he came to serve others. And I think that's a real humility that came from him in that instance like that. Another servant leadership definition I found that I really like is here is one who shares power, puts the needs of others first, and helps people develop and perform as highly as possible. So kind of ties into this one, but kind of elaborates a little more deeply into that. But again, you're empowering others basically with this. So you're not scared that people are going to outgrow you. In fact, you want them to outgrow you. And a lot of you fathers out here, you probably want your sons to grow up to be better men than you. So as good of a man that you may be, you'd love to see your son grow up to be a better man than you. And somebody say, hey, you know what, you've raised a great son. Your son's a great man. So again, another scripture I've got here out of Matthew again, chapter 28, verses 19 and 20. Aaron, can you get that one in just a second? But again, this is about preparing others to lead through you and kind of you almost creating almost like a family tree of sorts of leadership, of leading others here. So Aaron, go ahead with that one.
Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Surely I am with you always to the very end of the age.
So go and make disciples of all the nations, right? So now the multiplication effect. If you're the only one leading, that's an additional effect, because you can only lead one-on-one, man-to-man like that. But if you're going out and teaching them, hey, now you go and make disciples of all the nations. I made disciples out of you 12. Now you go out and make disciples, right? So then now that's the multiplication effect. So that's how growth happens a lot faster. Rather than me doing all the work as a leader, now instead I can empower other men to become leaders and their leaders and then leaders beyond that. So the multiplication effect happens when we can make disciples of others in that capacity like that. Now, and this is so important down here, lead by example, not by force, command, or words alone. And I think this is really important for, if you want people to follow you, you've got to lead by example. So I don't think it's very beneficial to lead by force because that's going to build resentment towards those people once they can kind of revolt against you or they can push back against you, or if they have more force than you, right? By command, that's just a teller, not a doer. So you're just telling people what to do. So you're just out there barking orders, and you lose respect on that. But you're going to gain the respect when you're leading by example. And then the words alone. This is where don't be a hypocrite. Do as I say, not as I do, kind of thing. So this is where you've got to be able to lead by example and use words if necessary. All right, now the next type, humble leadership, and this is where humility is another loose definition of humility. Here is the practice of meekness, obedience to God, respect of self and others, submissiveness, and modesty. And I think this is really important that we think sometimes, I think I didn't put it in here, but I think C.S. Lewis has a quote about humility. Does anybody know that humility quote that C.S. Lewis says? Thinking less of yourself is thinking of yourself less. And so it's not necessarily thinking you're lower than what you are, it's just thinking of others more than you're just thinking about yourself. So this is where humility really plays a big part in leadership. And meekness, and we're going to define meekness here in a little bit too. Meekness is not weakness, so don't mistake those two for the same thing. Very different. Obedience to God is that like I'm serving God, like my orders come from Him, right? So I'm being obedient to Him. Respect of self and others. A submissiveness is in surrendering to His will, and then the modesty is with the humility here. So again, one of the actionable examples I love about this, I talked about at the very beginning, was Jesus washing the feet of the disciples. I think this is where He didn't have to. And He didn't have to do a lot of things, but He chose to. And He chose to do that because He should give them an example of what they had to do, what He's calling them to do, right? So He had the highest of highest positions, right? So He's the the Messiah, the Savior, and now He humbled Himself to the position of basically a slave, a servant, and He's washing feet. And in those times, that was a pretty low job. There weren't many jobs that were lower than the ones that washed the feet. So He lowered Himself literally to the lowest position possible, given the circumstances, to lead by example, to show them. Now, the scripture, John chapter 13, verses 1 through 17, we're not going to read that, but that's the story of how Jesus washed feet and how He explains what He's doing and why He's doing it there. And this part is also really important because surrendering to His will. This is where you got to check your ego. So leaders don't have egos. Leaders are the ones that will surrender to His will and not try to be stubborn and get it done in their own way, get their own things done and have their own way. They're open to surrendering to His will. And I think there's a verse in here in Luke chapter 22, verse 42, that when Jesus is surrendering to His will, it's if you read it and you can see the imagery in your head, it's just really it's just gutting to read this. So can I get a volunteer to read Luke chapter 22, verse 42? Yep. And the cup of suffering was when He was about to hang on the cross the next day. So that was really, really tough. He's begging God, take this away from me. Like, don't make this happen. Don't make this, let me go through this. But if your will be done. And that's really hard. So, and then lastly about humility and the humble leader as responsibility and ownership. Like I said earlier, like the responsibility is like when things go wrong, the leader has to take responsibility for that in the workplace. So if a catastrophe happens at work, as a leader, you've got to take responsibility for that. If in the home, if something goes wrong, you've got to take responsibility for that, and then ownership of that. And so you are owning the fact that, hey, we came up short. This is we failed on X, Y, and Z. Or if you're a sports person, maybe like your game plan, you didn't execute the game plan or whatever, right? So you're taking ownership of that, and you're not blaming others. You're not pushing out, well, if this wouldn't happen, or if it wouldn't have been for this, no, it's their fault, or just you're not outsourcing the blame. You're internalizing it. You're taking it on hey, you know what? I own it. We're going to get better. We're going to learn from this. We're going to get better and do better next time. So this is a verse I like. It's a couple verses here. So can I get a volunteer to read this? So Clint, it's Philippians chapter 2, verses 7 through 11. And this is really about taking ownership and being responsible for, I guess your actions, so to speak here.
But emptied Himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, found in human form. He humbled Himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted Him and bestowed on Him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth,
Amen to that. So the point of this is that the lower you are willing to go as far as humility, the higher that the Lord can take you. Okay, so it's not about me. It's not about what I can do. It's about what I can do for Him, and it's surrendering to His will. The more you can surrender, the more you can submit to Him, the lower you're willing to go for Him, the higher He can take you. Again, moving into the next leadership, strong leadership, and this is something I love the images that Dan created for this because it just the bicep, flexing bicep, it implies strong, right? That's how men show strength is in their muscles sometimes, right? So I like this one fitting with this one here. So and what I like about this is you don't have to have a title to lead, and I think this is really important for us to understand that. If you're in a situation where if something goes chaotically wrong, you don't have to have time to find a leader sometimes. Sometimes you've got to step up and take action in that moment. You don't have time to sort out, well, hey, we got to call the boss, or hey, what, like building's on fire, who do we call? Like, sometimes you got to get people out of the building, right? And so in a case like this, you don't have to have the title to lead. Is saying that if you know what's right, if you know what the action is to take, and that God's put that discernment on you, it's okay to take that action without having to check with your boss. There's a saying that it's okay. It's better to ask for forgiveness and permission. And so you go through this and you get something done. Hey, I saved the people out of the building, but we busted a window. Okay, cool. I'm sorry we busted a window, right? So instead of going through the problem, we got to get them out the door. So it's a process of where you take action without having to go through the chain of command. And I'm not saying to ignore your chain of command or to go in the face of your supervisors and superiors, but when there's moments that call for leadership, you don't necessarily get to schedule those times when it comes up like that. So and there's an example here, Mark chapter 10, verses 42 to 45. Can I get a volunteer to read this? So Abraham, you can read this in just a second. Mark chapter 10, verses 42 through 45. And this is going to be about how willing you are to not necessarily be in the don't do it for the title, right? You're not getting into leadership. You're not doing these things to get a title, to get a position. You're doing it out of the goodness of your heart and about obedience to the Lord. So, Abraham, whenever you get that pulled up, go ahead and read that.
Just called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles, Lord, give them by officials, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be a slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, give his life as a ransom."
Exactly. So then this is the important part. Like some people use leadership and titles, they hold it over your head, right? So you have to do this because I'm your boss. You have to do this because I said so. And I think in some situations, you almost build resentment towards that person if they're just telling you because I'm the boss or because I said so. I think especially when we're little kids and you ask your parents permission to do something, they say no, and say, why not? It's because I said so. We never thrilled us when we were kids to be like, okay, fine, just because you said so. So we always wanted to know why and kind of wanted our way in that, right? So strength lies here in acknowledging weakness. And so this is where acknowledging your weaknesses can help you understand what you're good at and what you're not good at, right? So if you're not strong in a leadership capacity, whatever leadership capacity you're trying to be in, don't force yourself into that until you sharpen your skills to get better at that, right? So don't go into if you're good, if you're a fighter and you're good with your fist, you're not going into a gunfight, So it's common sense to not, play to your strengths is what I'm saying here, guys. So when you have weaknesses, acknowledge those, and you don't necessarily ignore those, but you play to your strengths. As some of you are going to be great in the sense of you're great laborers. Some of you are going to be great in the sense of you're good administrators. Some of you are going to be great with numbers. Some of you are great with your hands, whatever it is. So a person that's skilled with their hands probably isn't going to go and be an accountant, right? And somebody that's a skilled laborer is probably going to go into and be a nurse, or something like that. So play to your strengths rather than your weaknesses, but acknowledge your weaknesses so that you can kind of you don't put yourself in a position where you're leading from a weakness. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 and 10 gives us more about this, about acknowledging our weaknesses. So can I get a volunteer to read this? So Gilbert, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 and 10.
My grace is significant for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore I am well content with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong.
For when I am weak, I am made strong. And that's important because, again, so do what you can so that God can do what you cannot, right? So that's the important part about this is like you're acknowledging your weaknesses, and especially you're taking your ego out of this, right? Because you're not telling God, hey, I'm strong in this. I can do anything. I got all these things. I don't need you. No, I'm admitting my weakness. I need you in this. This is the void that I need you to fill. So one of the, and admitting weakness is admitting you're human, right? And all this because we all have a weakness or two. We've all got, so some of us have more weaknesses, right? But it's also like almost like admitting fault. It makes you real. It makes you human. And I think that's a Craig Rochelle quote. And Craig Rochelle is a pastor of a church that I really like, and I love reading his books, listening to the podcast about leadership specifically. And he always ends his podcast with this quote. He says, "People would rather follow a leader who is always real than one who is always right." And I think that's so important for us to acknowledge that, like, hey, like a real leader is more important than somebody that's just like, if you're always right, man, like, what are your flaws? Like, where's your weakness at? Where are you human at? And so to know that your leader is human really helps you more relatable to them, but also makes them more human, again, so you don't deify them like you would God. So strength and authority, I think this is important part too, that strength and authority go hand in hand together here. So authority is usually by position. So when you get handed or assigned or earn a title, you have authority and you have dominion over that. And so, and in terms of strength and authority, so I'll get a volunteer to read Mark chapter 21, verses 12 and 13. Who wants to read this? Tony, you got this? So again, it's Mark chapter 21, verses 12 and 13. So strength, you can use it to, it's okay to use your strength. And so what I mean here, and a righteous anger. And so Jesus displayed a righteous anger in this part right here. So if you're familiar with that story about Jesus flipping tables, so rarely did Jesus get violent. But this is one of those times where he had a righteous anger. So and he used that, and he used his strength in this instance to display that. So Tony, if you got that pulled up.
My house will be called a house of prayer.
Mm-hmm. So people were abusing their privileges, abusing what they had, abusing their resources, misusing them. So we had a righteous anger. So that's okay in that instance. So now it's just because you're in a bad mood, you start flipping tables. That's not what, Jesus wasn't just in a bad mood that day, right? So we had a righteous anger in that instance. So it wasn't just because he hadn't eaten for a while. He wasn't fasting at the time or anything like that, right? So it was a righteous anger. So now the meekness I mentioned a couple slides ago, meekness, a lot of people mistake meekness for weakness, and it's not necessarily one and the same. And I love this quote that I found online. I didn't find the person who is the origin of the quote, but meekness is a self-control of strength that makes us lambs in our own causes and lions for the cause of Christ. Right? And I think that's so cool. Lambs for our own causes, but lions for the cause of Christ. And I thought that was really cool because it makes us lamb. Okay, like I'm a lamb in my own cause. Wherever the Lord leads me, I'm willing to step back and be led in this. And I'm willing to be kind of like a little more meek in this rather than aggressive and violent. But then lions for the cause of Christ. And I thought that was really cool because that means that we're more ferocious, we're more strength and more, I guess for lack of a better term, violent in that, in a good way. But lions for the cause of Christ. So I thought that was a really good illustration of that, lions and lambs there. All right, guys. And then the last type of leadership we're going to talk about tonight is the quiet leadership. And a true leader is not always the loudest person in the room. I kind of talked about that earlier. So there are men in this room who rarely speak and rarely get up in front of the room or anything like that, but are very powerful, strong leaders. And I think there's a certain quality of that's admirable because they have the leadership, they have the strength, but they choose very selectively to use it, right? And so there's men in this world that they speak softly, and what is it? The president, I think it was, speak softly and carry a big stick, right? So like that's where maybe it meant a few words, but those words are so impactful when they do say them, right? So thinking about this, and I love this. So this example of talking versus communicating. And so this past weekend, I went to church at Community Bible Church, CBC, here in town on Saturday night. And Pastor Ed had this great quote. And he said, lots of people talk, but only a few people communicate. And I was like, man, that is really good, because a lot of people can just jabber and go on and yap up here or whatever. But the communication is, one, getting the point across to you. But secondly, communication is two ways, right? So it's coming back and forth. So I loved that quote, and I thought that was very accurate, because the quiet leaders are the ones that they're not just talking to you all the time, but they're engaging. They're asking you questions. So if you're fortunate enough to have a mentor in your life, like I do, then they spend more time asking me questions than they do telling me stuff. And I think that's a great way for me to learn and to grow. But also, it's a communication between us. It's not just a lecture. So it's not just, so for example, when you come to a Sunday sermon here at the churches, you get a message from the pastor. It's not a dialogue, right? It's just a lesson that they're teaching you. When we come to Brothers of Courage, this part is just a lesson. When we get the communication of the discussions and dialogues, we break into groups. But it's talking versus communicating. So let's make sure that it's reciprocated, and not necessarily just word for word reciprocation, but just the communication is back and forth here. And then again, same thing with this, a monologue versus a dialogue, right? So this is the part where I love this verse when I found this verse. So I want to get somebody to read this. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 19, but specifically in the Passion Translation. So if you got the Bible app and you can change the translations, check that out. So can I get a volunteer to read this? It's a really good one. Stephen, so Proverbs chapter 10, verse 19, specifically in the Passion Translation. But this is really, I love this. The Passion Translation is really intense as it is. But again, this is the difference, like between somebody just rambling on and somebody that's actually stopping to ask questions or listen.
Prove you are wise from the very start. Just bite your tongue and be strong.
Basically, shut up before you say something dumb. Is really what that comes down to, like that. And I think that's really important, because sometimes if you're just one of those people who just talks and talks and talks, eventually you're going to say something dumb. But the man of few words rarely says something dumb. And so now, this is a really important part too about the quiet leaders, that they listening to reply versus listening to understand. And I learned this in communications. It was actually in some marriage premarital counseling I did, that listening to reply versus listening to understand. This is where if you and your partner, or you and the person you're talking to, are engaged in a conversation, and you're talking to them, and as they're talking to you, all you're thinking about how you're going to respond to what they just said. So basically, use an example, you're loading your gun, right? So they're talking to you, and you're putting the bullets in your gun, and as soon as they shut up, bam, 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 you're firing back. So you're only listening to reply. You're not listening, you're not being present to what they actually have to say. So you're not trying to understand what they're saying or what they're saying to you. You're just listening to reply, so you can get your words in too, so you can make it even, right? And it's not about even. So versus listening to understand is where you're genuinely paid attention to the words that they're saying and the point that they're trying to make. And you can even use reflective listening and say, okay, so what I'm hearing you say is, and then you repeat what you think they said. And you may be right or wrong. And this takes practice, because we're all men here. We're fixers. So when we're talking to our spouse about a problem, she's going off about this problem, maybe something at work, maybe something with her family, maybe something with the kids, and she's telling you a problem. What does your mind automatically go to? How to fix it. Here's the solution. Here's 3 different things you can fix this. Here's 3 different ways you can fix this, right? What does she want? She probably just wants you to listen. She probably just wants to hear, get it out and to vent. She most likely isn't looking for an actual solution. She just wants to know that you care and listen. So one of the things I do in this situation, like when I'm talking to my wife, I'll say, is this something you want me to, are you wanting me to fix this, or do you want me to listen? Right, so that way I know right away what hat do I need to wear right now. So that way I'm not wearing the wrong hat as I'm listening to this conversation. So, but again, this is the types of listening you can do. And there's a proverb in here, Proverb 18:2 is really good about this as far as like listening and replying. So can I get a volunteer to read Proverbs chapter 18, verse 2? Abraham?
Fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions.
They don't want to understand. They just want to tell you their thoughts, right? They're not trying to understand you. They just want to tell you what they think about it. So, and then one of the quotes that I love, I used to swear by this when I was in the corporate workplace, when I was working and leading teams. people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I thought that was such a vital phrase and understanding for me to get because, for example, when I worked in the fitness industry, I thought I was really smart. I thought I was a great personal trainer. I thought I knew how to get success and results for all my clients. So I could go on and tell you about calorie deficiencies and what muscles to work and muscle recovery and muscle protein synthesis and delayed onset muscle soreness and all these things that are fancy words that I learned with my degree and my certifications. But the bottom line, they didn't understand what I was talking about. But two, they don't care how much I know until they knew how much I cared. And so I had to get them to understand that, hey, I'm here for you. I want to help you. Your success is my success. Let's do this together. I'm going to share my knowledge with you. But if I just led with all my knowledge, it didn't develop any type of relationship between us. So, and it's the same thing in any capacity that we're talking about now. Again, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And then throughout this, guys, you're going to find, like I mentioned earlier about that, if you can imagine like a big Venn diagram of 4 circles, there are going to be leadership styles that overlap. So from the quiet, the humble, the strong, and the servant leader, there's going to be types that kind of overlap a little bit here, and that's okay. I mentioned earlier, leadership style that focused on serving the needs of others and helping them grow was a definition of a servant leader, but that also falls into some of these others, helping them grow. You can do that by being a quiet leader or a humble leader. And then also one who shares power, puts the needs of others first, and helps people develop and perform as highly as possible. Well, that's all these. That's really leadership in general, but specifically you can apply it to more than just that one that we talked about right there. So again, overlapping styles of leadership. There's not one way that's better than another. However, I believe that as men, we're called to lead in some capacity. One way or another, I guess I should say, in lots of capacities, but one way or another. So finding the right leadership style that works for you is really important, because don't go through life just abdicating your leadership, right? Because if you're a husband, if you're a father, if you're a leader in the workplace, any of those roles, you're called to leadership. God designed us to lead. And so he didn't call us to be passive or indifferent. He called us to be strong and courageous. And so I want you to really think about this tonight as we talk about leadership. What type of leader are you, right? And what type of leader do you want to be? That's not part of the discussion questions, but as we go through these things, and the 4 that I listed tonight aren't the all-inclusive, exhaustive list. There are more styles of leadership that may be incorporated into life and even into the Bible. These are 4 that I found that I could really speak of and speak to tonight to the group. But find the leadership style that works for you and base it in the Bible, right? So don't try a leadership style just because it sounds cool or just because it's like what you saw this other guy do. Base it out of what God has put in you, and find the scripture that applies to that you can say, okay, this is the type of leader God has called me to be. Okay, so getting to the next part, the last part we're going to talk about is the places to lead, the environments we're called to lead in. So number 1, we're called to lead in the home, and so that's the most important part. Whether you're a husband or father, or if you're a bachelor, you got one of one to lead. That's not that hard, guys. So lead yourself so you can lead others. But leading in the home is so important because that's a reflection of you to the outward world, right? So like when your wife is a reflection of you. Your kids are a reflection of you. And I think, so do you take pride in that, or are you ashamed of that? Right? So that's something to think about with this. Now I love this verse, Joshua 24, verse 15. Can I get a volunteer to read this verse for us tonight? I guarantee you've heard this verse before. So where we go. So Joshua, so go ahead. I forgot your name, man. I'm sorry. Martin, okay.
Choose today who you will serve. Would you prefer the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or will it be the gods of the Amorites? As for me and my family, we will serve you.
Amen. Right. So, but as for me and my family, we will serve. Choose today who you will serve. As for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. And that's an example where this starts with you, leading your family to church on Sundays. If you're leading your family to men's group and a women's group on Thursday night too, it's even better. But leading your family, and maybe it's sitting down, having a devotional together as a family. Maybe sitting down with your wife and doing a study together. The Bible app has, the YouVersion Bible app has tons of plans on there that can be family friendly, that can be relational, can be, even if you're single, you can still read these plans and devote yourself to the Lord. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Another one here I really liked here. This was good. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. Another good reading about fathers and what we're called to do in this biblical role here. Abraham?
Fathers, do
So bring them up in training and instruction of the Lord. Raise your kids in church. And if your kids are already grown, it's not too late. They're still your kids. So you can still bring them to church with you, right? So, but raise them in the ways of the Lord. There, I want to put the proverb in. There's another proverb in here too that I could have put in here. I chose not to. So now we're talking about in the workplace here. So this is another place where we're called to lead is in the workplace. So people are looking up to you in the workplace. People are watching you in the workplace. So whether you know it or not, people are watching your actions and people are learning from you. Are they learning good or are they learning bad habits from you? Are you cutting corners or are you the guy the stand-up guy in the office, right? So are you the guy that, you waste the company time and, just messing around and getting paid for nothing? Or are you the guy that's working bell to bell? You're the guy that shows up on time every day, right? So this is a reflection of you here. So I've got a verse here, 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12, to apply this, our leadership. So Joaquin, go ahead and read this one for us. And then I've got another, somebody wants to prepare for the next verse. I got, Aaron, you want to take that next one?
1 Timothy 4:12. Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity.
And that's so in that context, Paul's talking to Timothy because he's young. He's a young man. But this can be if you're young in the workplace. If you have a position that's not the top in the workplace, you can still lead by example and still inspire the others to do what's right, regardless of your youth and your work youth there. Aaron, you've got, so the next one is Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 3, specifically in the NLT.
And now a word to you who are elders in the churches. I, too, am an elder and a witness to the sufferings of Christ, and I, too, will share in his glory when he is revealed to the whole world. As a fellow elder, I appeal to you. Care for the flock that God has entrusted you. Watch over it willingly, not grudgingly, not for what you will get out of it, but because you are eager to serve God. Don't lord it over the people assigned to your care, but lead them by your own good example.
Mm-hmm. So lots to unpack on there. Lead by your good example. Do it willingly. Do it for the Lord. But lead the flock that you've been assigned, that you've been blessed with, right? So in the workplace, you're probably leading a flock of people. This also can apply to the home as well here. But do it willingly. Do it for the Lord. Don't do it begrudgingly. And lead by example. And then lastly, another place to lead is going to be in the community. Again, could have tied this to church, but I want to make it more broad and put it in the sense of the community. A lot of us know this one here, so I'll get a volunteer to read it. But it's the golden rule. So I think in the community. So Jacob, I'll get you to read this in just a second. It's Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. But the golden rule really applies to us as believers. We can show the love of Jesus by going out into the world and not expecting anything from anybody, but going out and just doing, being the hands and feet and just doing. But again, leading by example. And then people will look at us, okay, that I can see that person is set apart. That person behaves different than the rest. So Jacob, Matthew 7:12 says what? Yep. Do to others as you would want them to do to you. So that's even more secular. People take that out, and that's one of the few things out of the Bible that applies. People will take out and secularly apply, and so it's a widely accepted. Do unto others as you'd want them to do to you. And last, I just love this part right here, guys. Like I say this over and over. But if you're not serving in his house, don't expect to be served in yours. So this is an important part, that serving is leadership. Serving isn't below anybody. If Jesus was serving, I think we can too. Jesus found it, and then he served in the lowest of the positions, right? So don't think you're above serving by just because your age, your title, your experience, anything like that. You're not too good to serve. So we're gonna break into our discussion questions tonight, guys. So we'll get these going into a couple of groups here. But what type of leadership do you most relate with out of those four? Again, it was, and I'll put those up here in just a second again. And then secondly, how can you better serve those you lead? How can you better serve those you lead? So in the capacity of if you have leadership in your home, leadership in the workplace, in your community, whatever it may be. So how can you better serve those that you lead? And then lastly, in what areas or ways do you want to grow as a leader? So where do you find that, I want to be a better X, Y, or Z. I want to be a better doer. I want to be less of a hypocrite. I want to be more intentional about my word. I want to be more punctual. I want to be a better leader by example, whatever that may be here. So these are the discussion questions for tonight, guys. We'll break into our groups.